Tell me all about your latest obsession. Are you a fan? Got guilty pleasures? Yeah, your confessions. What the hype? What the hype? Take me from fan to stand. What the hype? What the hype? Ooh, what's the hype? Yeah. What the hype?
Welcome to What the Hype. I'm Andrew.
I'm Eric.
I'm Maura.
I'm Micah.
And I'm Pamela.
Drop that heavy book and instead pick up some headphones because this week we're discussing the pros and cons of listening to audiobooks as well as why they've grown in popularity and hype. So, to get things started, I want to give everybody a quick run through of the state of audiobook listening. So as of 2023, according to the Audio Publishers Association and Edison Research, the size of the audiobook listening market has grown. The majority of U.S. adults, 53%, say they have listened to an audiobook, which is up from 45% in 2022. And this translates to nearly 140 million Americans who have ever tried the medium. The majority of audiobook listeners are young, with 57% being between the ages of 18 and 44, which is significantly higher than the 49% of the U.S. population that falls within the same age range.
Audiobook listeners today closely match the U.S. population, with 29% of audiobook listeners identifying as either African American or Hispanic, compared to 27% of the U.S. population, suggesting increased diversity amongst listeners. And by category, audiobooks for children had the fastest rate of growth in 2022 at 41%, but remain a small component of the total market. Similarly, non-English language titles are expanding rapidly at 37%, but are still just 4% of the total market.
Fiction, 64%, has increased as a proportion of total sales for the second consecutive year. The fastest growing genres are humor, nonfiction, and romance. However, fiction and science fiction/fantasy remain the two largest genres overall. And it's actually been a very popular part of Spotify over the last year, but we'll explain that a little later today.
Is there a
those
quiz?
are the latest stats. Yes, there will be a quiz at the end of today's program.
There's a lot of stats.
And whoever fails gets kicked off the
Ooh,
panel,
okay.
right? That's the
why
rules,
there's five
right?
of us.
Yeah.
Survivor rules for What the Hype? Yeah.
Well, that would be voted off, right?
Oh, all right.
Well, yeah, let's vote somebody off at the end of today. High stakes. So what's everybody's current relationship with audiobooks?
Well, I kind of recently got more into listening to audiobooks, I would say in the last few years or so. And I am somebody that likes to track my reading throughout the year using StoryGraph. So for any book readers out there, you'll probably be familiar with that. But obviously Goodreads is a good way to do that too. And by using those, I know that it makes up about a third of what I read. So I average about, maybe like 20, 30 books a year. It's like 9 of them probably are audiobooks. I feel like that's a pretty sizable number, but it's not like the majority of how I read. I also tend to do a lot of hybrid reading. So if I'm really into a book, then I'll check the audiobook out at the library too, so that I can take it with me on the go. So I'll read the physical book when I'm at home, and when I'm walking my dog, I'll pop the audiobook on and I can just keep enjoying the story without actually having to be at home or in a place where I can be physically reading. So that's kind of how I use audiobooks in my daily life.
That's multifaceted reader. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it's like you don't skip a beat. That's really, really cool. How do you...
Not for everything, but for some things.
How do you manage that, though? I mean, if you're reading, you get up to a certain place and you're going to switch over to the audiobook. How are you able to sort of keep track of where you are one place and the other and know where to get to without getting spoiled in the audiobook version in case you get too far ahead?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I use Libby for audiobooks because I check out audiobooks exclusively through my local library because it's free. Please support your local libraries. That's a soapbox that I'll be on all the time whenever I can. And so basically all I do is I keep track of the chapter I'm at. Libby makes it really easy to look at the chapter index. And then I'll just rewind 5-10 seconds and take a look at what the last sentence was in the audiobook or vice versa in the book. And I'll flip around from the start of the chapter based on that. But if I can at all, like if I can control it, I try and finish the chapter so that I can just start at a new chapter. And that makes it a lot easier for me.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Okay, that
Otherwise, I
makes
could see that being
sense.
a pain. But good for you for juggling.
Yeah, that's really cool. I will say I had a similar experience with the Hunger Games recently. I got into the original trilogy reading, and I ended up getting the audiobook and also the ebook on Kindle. And through the app, there's the seamless functionality where as long as
that's cool.
the reading portion is on Kindle, it'll actually swap like by the word within 5-10 seconds of where you left off reading when you want to switch to the audiobook. So I had to
That's
get both.
cool.
I had to get both, but the audiobook is read by Tatiana Maslany, and it's
Oh, that's
really, really
inappropriate.
cool. So
Mhm.
yeah, that was a way I was able to do. I think I was traveling that weekend when I went through those books again, and I could just infinitely change format, but it did cost some money. It wasn't through my library, unfortunately.
Laura, what's your relationship with audiobooks?
So I actually listen to audiobooks pretty rarely. It's not because I don't like them. There have been a few that I've listened to that I really enjoyed. But there's just something about my brain that it works a lot better for me when I'm reading if I'm holding something physical because I like to make notes in the margins of books that I'm reading. I like to mark things with sticky notes, particularly when we're preparing for a show like this and I want to be able to easily reference things. I just like to have a little bit of a written paper trail in the book itself. It just helps it, I don't know, sink in easier for me and keeps me on track. But I will say that when I do enjoy listening to an audiobook is when it's being narrated by the author of the book. So that I think is particularly true when it's like works of nonfiction or memoir. I am a pretty big fan of memoir. So if you give me a good memoir and the author is the one who narrates the audiobook, I'm so there for it.
They're a real one when they do that.
Mm-hmm.
How about you,
Yeah.
Micah?
Well, as you can see behind me, I'm a huge proponent of audiobooks.
No wonder you have this new set.
Are those books behind you hollowed out, and are there CDs in them?
You know, that's a story for another time, Eric.
Oh.
Maybe when we do more of a detective series, that might be appropriate. But yeah, but no, in all seriousness, similar to Laura, I don't listen to audiobooks regularly, but I can certainly appreciate why people do. And I think that there's certainly an authenticity that can come from the author narrating their own work. And I'm sure that there are points of emphasis and moments of strong emotion that the author can convey much differently through spoken word. That said, again, as you can see, I much prefer having physical copies of a book in my hands and kind of creating my own experience. And I was thinking about this. Is it a generational thing? You know, I'm a little bit older. I don't know that it puts me in a totally different generational category than you all, but it's something that I was thinking about. And I'm curious to get your response. And the last thing I'll just say, though, is I think there's a sense of achievement in finishing a physical book that I'm not entirely sure is you get from an audiobook, but I don't want to assume that.
I think I feel pretty accomplished when I finish an audiobook, personally. But I see what you mean. You get to close it and you put it on your shelf. It's like a little trophy. Like, I read that. It's off my to be read pile.
I love finishing an audiobook and hearing that audio pre-recorded that they did, I don't know, 20 years ago when Audible was founded that says, this is Audible. So you get it at the very end and it's like, yeah, I did it.
As for the generational thing, I mean, we just read some stats here that said 57% are between the ages of 18 and 44. So, I mean, you're in that age range, right? You're what, 19, 20? So,
Yeah.
Also, I just wanted to call out Micah, you being like, I'm a little bit older. I'm like, but you're like a few years older.
I know.
You make it sound like you're like
Such a
35
gap.
years older than everyone else.
Like he's the grandpa of What the
I'm
Hype.
too old for this episode.
Yeah,
of
well,
What
when
the
we get
Hype.
to the debate, I'm going to be pulling out my rocking chair and rifle from the sound of things.
Oh,
but
Back in
yeah.
my day.
Well,
Yikes.
Here's what I'll say to your question, Micah. I think everything, especially audiobooks, has become more portable, right? Even 15, 20 years ago, you needed a CD player that wouldn't skip if you wanted to take it on a car trip, or a CD player in your car. It was impossible to listen to audiobooks. And now because of streaming and the internet and LTE and all this stuff, we have all of these options. So it's possible that there's...
5G.
Yeah, there's possible there's a generational curve just because the accessibility has skyrocketed for people that were older, they just haven't developed the habit. Versus if you're younger, you started when you're younger and you have more of a habit by now. That would be my question.
Absolutely.
I would also just say that I think people feel like they need to pay for audiobooks. And again, I will get on my soapbox about visiting your local library, getting a library card because it's all free. That is such a nice feature. And you don't even have to go in anymore. Like I remember checking out audiobooks from the library when I was younger and they still came in like CD format. My library still had stuff on tape for all the old people that didn't have CD players. But now you can just check them out from your phone anywhere you are for free. And
Yeah.
I think that's really cool. But I think that a lot of times maybe people don't even think about that. They just assume, oh, if I'm going to pay for a book, I'd rather just pay for a Kindle version or a physical version. I don't want to give Audible money. I don't want to pay for an audiobook that I might not go back and listen to. So it's just good to let people know there are free options out there too.
Yeah, I mean, you'll hear me talk about throughout this episode, Audible and stuff. That's just what I use regularly. But
Oh, for
here's
sure.
my
Like,
library card.
No shade to Audible, but I just think that it gets expensive. I get why people
does.
don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I've had
And what
to
if you don't
pause it.
like the book?
Yeah, I've had to pause it a bunch. The thing for me though, and it's such an important call out, Pam, because there are other methods. Here's my library card. I have it.
Ooh,
I'm gonna get it on Libby.
It's
I
shiny.
promise.
Bless.
That's my commitment.
Just want to save you money, Eric.
I appreciate
And we'll get
it,
to
Pam.
ways to listen to audiobooks later. We'll go through the full
Andrew,
list.
what's your relationship with being lazy?
Thank you for asking. So this year I started seriously getting into laziness. I mean, listening to audiobooks. No, I don't
Oh.
consider it lazy at all. And the reason I wanted to give it a try is because so often I want to read more. It can be a New Year's resolution, and then I don't end up reading more. So I've started listening to audiobooks, particularly when walking my dog at night, because that's when I go on longer walks with him, and it's helped me read more. Now, it also has been a practice in focus because my mind can wander. But I've really enjoyed listening to audiobooks while on walks because then I'm not listening to podcasts about the real world. And it's also a nice way to clear my head at night.
So I respect you, Andrew, but I have to say, as like a true crime junkie, I'm hearing you talk about having headphones in while you're walking your dog at night, and it sounds like the start to an episode of Dateline.
Or the
So-
X-Files.
That's why I don't share my address on the
You're-
podcast.
you're in
the
the middle of
killer
the desert.
coming.
I do look over my shoulder from time to time if I think I hear something. But
Yeah,
you're
but don't-
right, Laura. And I recently got noise canceling AirPods, and that's made things really dangerous. I shouldn't be telling people this.
Remember when I was out staying with you and you went out to walk Brooklyn and I think you texted or you called us and there were like these really weird lights in the sky. And apparently it was just like a satellite going by. But I'm concerned for you, Andrew, the fact that you're walking out in the middle of the desert by yourself. I mean, there could be animals, there could be snakes and scorpions and other things that you're just not paying attention to.
Life is all about risks.
Okay.
And if that's the way the good Lord is going to take me, then so be it.
All right.
Eric, what is your relationship with audiobooks?
I agree that they're a great opportunity if you have the availability. What I found, I got into audiobooks maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, and I've stayed really consistent. They are 85 or higher percent the books that I go through. It's how I get my reading done. Basically, I drive a lot for work, and I realized a couple of years ago that was so much missed opportunity. I was listening to music playlists and not necessarily, I was the same music. So I wasn't necessarily broadening my mind. And that was a perfect opportunity to broaden my mind while I'm, mostly in traffic. And so I started going through audiobooks, books I hadn't read before, books I was interested in, and absolutely fell in love. I also think that there's something very primal about having a story read to you. Oral storytelling actually predates the written word. So I don't see audiobooks as this newfangled thing to adjust to. I see it as the OG. This is how Gilgamesh was first told, was first experienced. So I'm just a big fan of audiobooks in general, what they bring. And I do think they really activate a part of our brain that makes me feel just as creative, just as inspired as if I were sitting and reading something.
Yeah, there is something warm and fuzzy about that. Like, it kind of takes you back to when you were a little kid and your caregivers would tell you stories. I always used to ask for bedtime stories when I was little.
Yeah.
That all said, Eric, you're a big fan of audiobooks. Do you feel like you take the story in differently when you're listening to an audiobook?
I think if anything, I might take it in more with, a lot of the books that I have done on audiobook, they're very long. I listen to audiobooks that run like 25 to 40 hours long. It's like The Stand. It's like Stephen King's It. It's even bigger, longer books that, the classics. I read The Odyssey, narrated by Claire Danes. But yeah, like for me, the print on all of those books is way too small. I have glasses that do the trick for vision, but I cannot, under any circumstances, even if I had the time, sit and actually take in too much of a book where the print is just tiny, or I'm flipping the page and there's like 400 pages to go. It's like The Tale of Two Cities. I'm like more like The Tale of 2,000 hours. It would just take me so long to get through it. And so I find audiobooks, exactly how much of the time commitment is, and I can really work it in.
Pam, it doesn't hit for you the same way, right?
No, it doesn't. Well, sometimes it does, but I'm a little bit of the opposite in the sense that usually because I'm listening to audiobooks when I'm doing something else, I find that sometimes if I'm not fully invested or in the mood to be taking in a story, then I start thinking about other things. Like my mind wanders and I miss details. So then I have to go back and rewind, or I just, kind of decide to make peace with that and keep on going, depending on how deep the subject matter is. But I do find that when I'm reading, like, yes, my eyes can glaze over, but because I have the book in my hands, it forces me to focus a little bit more. Although I will agree with you that I feel like audiobooks are a great way to take in classics, because sometimes classics can be so dry for our minds, which are not used to the way that they were written or the words that are used. So hearing somebody's sometimes dramatic interpretation of that can be a really great way to actually get invested into books that maybe we were forced to read even in school, that we've come back to as adults and like actually enjoyed because we've enjoyed them in a different medium. So
Yeah.
I agree with that. I feel like an audiobook, in terms of the narration itself, it is a performance. And I think depending on the quality of that performance, it can bring something else out in the story, or even in the nonfiction that's being articulated that maybe I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. I mean, it can be small things, just like their emphasis on certain phrases or words, or even the voices that they choose to represent certain characters that maybe I wouldn't have envisioned myself.
yeah,
So,
words in fantasy series too, because sometimes you don't know how to pronounce
oh
things.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then you're like, oh, that's how you pronounce it. Okay, I'm going to make a mental note.
Yep.
Mhm.
I've had that happen so many times.
For me, though, this just raises a lot of questions. One thing that actually came to mind when you were all talking was, do you feel like it impacts your imagination at all? Like, normally when you're sitting with a book, it's just you and the book. So you're interpreting it as you read, and certain things are created inside of your head as a result of that. And I'm curious, with an audiobook, because it's being narrated by somebody else, do you feel like that stifles your imagination at all, or does it add to it? Like, I'm guessing it could be both, depending on the type of book, but
Yeah, I feel like I'd have a stronger answer on this if I had been reading more or listening to more fantasy series, but I haven't thus far.
Mm.
And I don't think the books that I've listened to have demanded too much imagination.
Mhm.
Like one's a LGBT political drama of sorts, and that one just doesn't really demand much
Right.
imagination.
I guess for me, the only thing that changes is like maybe the narrator's voice is how you then imagine that character's voice, but I still envision things the same way. Like my mind is still painting pictures. So to me, it doesn't like stifle that creativity, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give an example of Game of Thrones. When I read Game of Thrones sitting in my, chair, all the characters have my accent. Maybe one or two of them I remember to do a British accent for, but Roy Dotrice, who does the audiobooks, who actually is the Guinness World Record holder for most voices in an audiobook, he's British and he does the right accents. And so I feel in that case, the verbal treatment that I get from the audiobook is a far enhanced version and yet more authentic version than I myself could bring to the role because I'd forget to be British all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't we feel like, though, that even if you're just sitting down and physically reading a book, our own interpretations and imagination as it relates to that story is also being influenced by the other things in our lives? Like, I know when I was a kid, and, I don't mean to bring up Harry Potter because I know
How
that
dare you?
we have such a history of talking about Harry Potter, but at the time that I was reading Harry Potter for the first time, I was also super into Crash Bandicoot. And Eric, I know you're going to laugh at me for this, but somehow in 11-year-old Laura's head, I imagined Cortex as Snape when I was reading the first book. And it was just like there was something about the character at the time that made the connection seem very clear. So I think even when we are sitting down and reading the books ourselves, our interpretations are also colored by the world that we live in, the things that we're into, our other interests. All of that stuff kind of leaches in, whether you're listening to an audiobook or not.
Laura, I need that version of Snape in my veins. Can we max that? Can we push the button for max that?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
It can still happen. That's
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who just is not as familiar with audiobooks or just hasn't spent as much time listening to them, I'm curious about that. I'm curious about things like, does listening to an audiobook make you want to pick up the sequel or other works by the same author, depending on how the book is read? And knowing that sometimes the person who's narrating is not the author. And I'm assuming that there could be multiple books that are out there with multiple narrators of the same author. So,
and sometimes it's just a bad narration too. It could very well be that the narrator they selected is not a good one.
It does happen.
The Fourth Wing audiobook, actually, Pam, you told me about this, and it looks like Laura agrees. It's not good.
It's rough.
No.
Yeah.
I had to listen on I had to speed up the voice, which is something nice too that you can do.
Yeah.
Nowadays you can speed it up. Sometimes that helps if it's a bad narrator. I also couldn't like even back in the day, I could not get through the Twilight audiobooks because the person who narrates that also voiced Ginger in As Told by Ginger on Nickelodeon. And I just like
What?
could not
It's
get
all
out
over
of
for
that
Pam.
character.
Yeah.
That's all I could see because
I
it
didn't
sounds
realize
just like her.
that.
It's sad to hear about this through recent fantasy with Fourth Wing, because I also felt the same way about the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes audiobook. It's kind of a deal breaker trying to get
I was
through
trying
it.
to listen to that. Yeah,
Who
it was tough for
narrated
me
that?
too.
It's
I don't know.
Don't know their name. I didn't memorize it, but that one's been hard to get through.
Maybe it's for the best we don't call the
I
person's
know.
name out on air.
I memorized
Micah
everyone
Tannenbaum
else's names
sucked.
that do a good job. Yeah.
But to get back to Micah's initial question, for me, it doesn't really bother me because like if I have to sit through an audiobook that I didn't particularly enjoy, I'll just pick up the book for the sequel because like this it doesn't change how I feel about whether the story was good or not. I just like will not go back and listen to audiobook 2.
Will you stop completely reading an
Sometimes,
audiobook?
sometimes, yeah, and I'll just go get the physical copy if it's the book I really want to read. Like I did that with Fourth Wing. Basically, I ended up that was when I ended up hybrid reading, and I knew I was going to do that for the first book because I'm just very intimidated by fantasy. I didn't realize it was actually light fantasy when I picked it up. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get the book, I'm going to get the audiobook, and I'm going to read them together, and it's going to be fine. So.
To that point, I've been listening to Tomorrow and Tomorrow, which is a YA novel. The narrator, not good, kind of flat. And I stopped listening to the audiobook, but I've heard so many good things about the book, and I get the story. I see that the story is great. I just don't enjoy this listening experience, so I'll probably get the book. Plus, the cover is really cool. So,
what is it with these new recent books getting a fail on the narrator?
It's not even recent books though, because the whole reason I didn't used to be an audiobook listener before is because I'm so picky about the narrator. If the voice doesn't like do anything for me, or if I like it's just like not vibing, then I just don't want to finish it.
You're saying.
Yeah, there's no hype there.
Oh, where's the hype?
Yeah. I used to be such a big hater because of that. So I've turned over a new leaf.
So we will debate if audiobooks should be considered reading at all, and we're going to look at how to read and listen to these books. Plus, we'll make some recommendations after this break. Okay, debate time, y'all. This is a hot button issue. I've seen it debated online, so I wanted to discuss it a little bit today. Should listening to an audiobook be considered reading? Now, Micah and Pam are going to stand against considering it reading, and then Eric and I will come through at the end explaining why it should be considered reading.
All right. Well, to start, I want to make it clear that I'm not arguing whether reading a book is better than listening to it. That comes down to personal preference at the end of the day. But I just don't believe you can count listening to an audiobook as reading it. One, because you didn't take part in the physical act of reading. And two, the medium of consumption isn't the same. Take something like Shakespeare. If you saw Othello performed for you, would you leave the theater and say you read the play? No, you'd leave knowing that you understood the story and you remember parts of it, but the means by which you consumed it was theater, not reading. And it's the same with listening to a book. It's being read to you, much like the play is being performed for you. The audiobook narrator read the book, not you.
Ouch. Oof.
Wow.
Man.
Well, to explain a little bit more on what Micah said about how it's a different medium of consumption entirely, I totally agree. There's something to be said for choosing to set aside time from your day to sit down and curl up with a book. I feel like that requires a focus that just isn't always necessary when you're listening to audiobooks, which I've also touched on as part of this discussion as a whole. You can't really multitask when you're reading a physical book, but you definitely can when you're listening to audiobooks. I know I definitely do other things when I'm listening to audiobooks. I craft, I walk my dog, I make dinner. And I'm sure other people do that too, which is great. But are you really giving the book the attention it deserves if you're multitasking or even listening at 2 or 3 times the speed? Or, yeah, I just don't think you're consuming it in the same way. There's just no way.
Eric, save us.
I must. Okay. Saying that listening to audiobooks is not really reading is just another form of gatekeeping, I'm afraid.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's kind of gatekeepy. Being able to sit down and physically read is a form of privilege. If there's one thing we can all agree on throughout our lives, I think we've learned that different people take in and process information differently. And I don't think that sitting around in a dusty chair with the book should be the only thing that classifies as reading. I feel like audiobooks work for me with the way my brain is inspired and feels creative going through stories. It does sometimes take that audio angle.
This portion of the show brought to you by Swiffer. Eric, we're going to be sending you a Swiffer, and you're going to dust your chair, and you won't believe how
I do actually need to... I was going for dusty book, but somehow it ended up dusty chair, so I don't know.
I think Eric's
So-
just doing a fantastic job of connecting the threads of Gatekeeper between this episode and our Ghostbusters episode.
I was a little bit of a breadcrumb there. I don't know. Nice work.
Well, I think so. It seems like Micah mainly takes this issue with the word, using the word reading to say, I read this book when you listen to it. I think it should be considered reading, consuming the story, because you are taking in the exact same story, just via different input, your ears versus your eyes. And I don't think it matters which of these two gifts from God it's being ingested through. You are still consuming the same exact story using the words written by the author. And sure, you have to pay attention more. And that has been, again, a lesson for me. It's been a learning experience. But you can also mindlessly skim through a book as well. I've been guilty of just reading, but my eyes are just moving left to right along the lines. Anybody else? Like, I guess I'm reading, but half of my brain is reading and the other half is thinking about the weekend or something like that.
Yeah, well, that's the great thing that Pam and Laura have talked to in this episode too, is like you can be distracted while physically reading too.
Of course you can. But
Yeah.
I think the question that was posed was, should listening to an audiobook be considered reading?
I think it should be.
Yeah.
I still think it should
I'm
be.
glad God was factored
God
into
made
the equation here
appearance.
too. Like,
This
we
show
got
has a
his
biblical angle,
her
just so
input on
everybody
it.
knows.
Well, listen,
We're
I
giving
mean,
you
here's-
God is a
here-
woman, according to
Here's what
Ariana
I'll say
Grande.
too. Some people are not sighted, and some people can't listen to things. And who are we to say what is and isn't reading a book?
Well, then you're just getting into the discussion of definitions of words, and I think
Well, I
that
think we
can
should
go down.
expand,
Mhm.
in this case, your definition of reading to be
Mm.
beyond the.
Well, look,
eyeball.
I'm not Merriam-Webster here. I'm not the
Yeah.
official source. You don't open me up and I say reading is ...
That would be really cute.
We should ask Merriam-Webster.
And I think we all understand that there are certain limitations that all people have when it comes to certain mediums. And that's why, all these different options are being put out there. And I think that that's fantastic. But in the context of this debate, we're asking whether listening to a book is the same as reading a book. The two verbs are totally different. They're opposite. To talk about senses, like they're different forms of consumption. It has,
Yeah.
That's actually a good point. I never hear someone say, I'm going to read my audiobook.
Well, it's kind of one of those things where we've yet to define a word that fits. So it's
That's
like I say
true.
oh, I've gone through an audiobook, or I've listened on audio, or I've every word, unlike what Micah said about in case it's an adaptation or an abridged version, every single word that the author wrote is being funneled through your brain. It's just in a different way as when you listen to an audiobook. So I do think it counts as something. Whether that something is reading is debatable semantics.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think the approach of looking at it as gatekeeping, we're not here to try and invalidate one over the other. We're making a argument based on the question of whether or not one thing constitutes reading or not.
Yeah, but I can see this being used to make somebody who listens to audiobooks exclusively, like me, feel bad because I haven't read a book sitting down in my newly Swiffered chair.
Fight.
Yeah.
Swiffered chair.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because the
Yeah.
only way that this argument nets out is for somebody who listens to audiobooks to feel bad because we've agreed that they're not reading.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, though, really quickly, because I feel like the readers that I know judge me because I don't read as many books as them in a year.
You
it's
read
because
30 books a year, Pam.
That-
Who is
yeah, but
reading
I
more than you?
people that listen to audiobooks on double speed and they go, really, that's it? I read 150 books. And it's like, that's great for you. But also if I'm physically reading, I try and read 2 books a month. That's a goal I set for myself. If I don't hit it, it's fine. But I'm trying, but it's it's like a superiority complex. And I see it also online in fandom spaces all the time. And it sucks because reading, at the end of the day, reading is reading. And you should just be great. You expanded your mind and your imagination for this day, regardless of how you decided to do that. But when it becomes like a weird sort of like competition with like bragging rights, it's
How
really
many words
odd.
can I have thrown at me?
Right.
No, that sounds
Exactly.
awful
Yeah.
too. Because maybe the best way to judge whether something is reading or not is to go back to like the original like accelerated reader standards and have to answer a context clue like quiz afterwards for how much retention you had. And if you pass the retention
Right.
quiz,
Just like
then you
if
get
you remember
to say,
the stats from the top of this episode, right?
Yeah.
One of us is
And you
getting
better,
voted
because
off.
there will be a
Right.
quiz at the end.
You,
But-
you finish that audiobook and Micah just pops up and is like, pop quiz, asshole. see how much you remember from this book.
Mike, a final point, and then we'll wrap this portion.
Yeah, no, I don't think that we need to try and like raise one form of consumption over the other and label it in the sense of like, because it's almost like if you're saying that you're not reading it, this, I guess the way that it's being perceived is as a slight. It's not. It's just like I was saying earlier, you can consume these stories in so many different ways. You can read them, you can listen to them. They can be performed for you, right? On stage, in a movie theater, on a television, right? Like
I like to swallow my stories personally.
Yeah. Well,
How's that taste?
Well, it depends. It's, just like any candy or whatever.
Oh, candy.
That's, you know what? That's a future means of consumption that maybe you should explore. There could be a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
Very Willy
Listeners,
Wonka.
Andrew wants you to tell him your stories so he can swallow them.
I'm just going to move
All
on.
right.
Listeners, where do you settle on this debate? Let us
Oh,
know
boy.
on social media. So here are some ways to listen to audiobooks for free or cheap, as Pam has brought up. You can borrow digital versions of audiobooks from your local library. Many libraries hook into the Libby app, which Pam also mentioned, which lets you borrow ebooks. And just like at a real library, you might need to join the waitlist before you can gain access, and you'll have access to the audiobook for a limited amount of time. I mentioned Spotify at the top of the episode. Spotify premium members get 15 hours of audiobook listening per month. You can purchase extra hours if you want. This is actually why I started listening to audiobooks, because I was already a Spotify premium customer. And then they added this. So I was like, well, this is a no-brainer. Might as well. No extra cost. 25% of Spotify customers have been using this new perk. So another way, and Eric has mentioned this episode really should be brought to you by Audible. Audible, it's probably the most well-known audiobook platform. It's probably considered the OG digital audiobook platform. You can get credits each month that you can then use to purchase audiobooks. And yes, once you use a credit on Audible, you actually own that audiobook. These aren't for rent. So that's pretty nice.
And debate aside, I think it is important just to reference that audiobooks provide a much needed alternative for folks who, for any number of reasons, can't read or find it challenging.
So which books should you start with? We'll share some favorites and also try to record our own audiobook passages after this break. So let's get into some recommendations. Do we have certain genres we prefer listening to over reading, first of all? Or do we prefer fiction or nonfiction?
Andrew, I was surprised by my habits or practices because I went into audiobook listening thinking I'd be like a big science fiction guy, just like I am like while reading. I tend to like that. The most time I've spent with audiobooks has been in the realm of nonfiction or historical fiction. Like by far, it is not close. I'm thinking of the two longest audiobooks I've spent time on are Devil in the White City, by Eric Larson. It's this history of Chicago World's Fair and the serial killer H.H. Holmes, juxtaposed with all these sources cited. It's absolutely insane. And then the other is a very large Beatles biography called Tune In by Mark Lewisone, narrated by Clive Mantle. And that is 40 hours on the Beatles' history, and it ends in 1962 before they got big. So I know all about Ringo's grandparents. I know all this stuff on the early Beatles. And the author, it took 10 years to write that book, and more sequels are on the way, like to cover the rest of the time. But I was just blown away by all these things that I'm taking in through audiobook.
That's pretty sweet. Yeah.
I'm a little heavier on the nonfiction side of things. I think I mentioned that earlier, that really if I'm listening to an audiobook, it's either nonfiction or some kind of memoir. So some recent listens for me, and they're not all that recent because again, I don't listen to a ton of audiobooks, but A Promised Land by Barack Obama and Beyond the Wand by Tom Felton. He is such an entertaining audiobook reader, by the way. And I mean, Obama, how can you not love listening to that man's voice for for 80 million hours, however long it took me to get through that book, because it's longer than the Bible.
And he has said a part 2 is coming.
I
It's
know.
taking longer than I think we anticipated, but more to come there. More for you to enjoy, Laura. More for you to... Never mind. Pam, where do you land?
I also really enjoy nonfiction, specifically autobiographies and memoirs like Laura, if the person that wrote them is narrating them. I just think that it adds an entirely different layer to the story of their lives they're trying to tell. And oftentimes you get subtext through the cadence of their voice in certain passages that you just wouldn't get in a regular book. So I will opt for the audiobook version anytime for books like that. And then, like, as an aside, this is not genre specific, but I also tend to gravitate towards audiobooks if it's something that I need to read or reread quickly for work, specifically since I work in pop culture. Adaptations are a big thing. It's like, oh, like maybe I read that YA novel that's getting a movie made about it, but I read it, when I was 18. So I don't want to read it again necessarily, but I can audiobook it pretty quick. So I'll do it that way.
So I actually think nonfiction is easier for me to listen to because it feels like listening to a podcast in some ways. It's almost like Barack Obama is just recounting his life story on a podcast. And this might be a controversial take, but you don't have to focus as hard when it's nonfiction. If it's an autobiography, I feel like you don't need every little piece of the puzzle. Whereas with fiction, I'd be paranoid about missing something really important that I'll need to remember later on.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, they probably will spend more time on the big life events, so you can't miss it as easily.
Yeah, and you kind of know where they are today if you're listening to their autobiography, so you might know a bunch about them to begin with.
Yeah.
So let's make some recommendations, specific titles. Eric, what have you really enjoyed?
I really tried to rein this in. I really did. But one of my favorite audiobooks for sure is the one I most recently listened to. It's Project Hail Mary, written by Andy Weir, who did The Martian. And the audiobook narrator who I'm shouting out here is named Ray Porter. It's just one of the best performances, and really everything that the book is amazing about and that author is good at is brought to life in the narration. So shout out to Project Hail Mary. I did also mention Tune In the Beatles All These Years by Mark Lewison. That narrator's Clive Mantle, and he voices each of the Beatles in interview footage, so that's really cool. It by Stephen King, another long one, absolute epic saga, narrated by Stephen Weber. And I'll also shout out finally Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, an amazing Napoleonic Wars versus fairy-like creatures, historical fiction narrated by Simon Preble.
And some of my more recent favorites include Crying in H Mart, which is a memoir. It's written and read by Michelle Zauner. She's a indie pop artist. Her moniker is Japanese Breakfast, and I just love her music. And this book is so good. I can't remember the last time an audiobook actually made me cry, but I was like sobbing during certain parts of this. And it's just a beautiful memoir about what it was like for her growing up as a Korean American in the Pacific Northwest, and also her relationship with her mother, who passed when she was pretty young, and how she correlates that to like the struggle she felt with like the pressure of being first generation American when her parents were immigrants and stuff like that. It's just such a beautiful book. And the audiobook is incredible. So I would highly recommend that. And then just for like a little fun listen, I love the Golden Compass, the 2006 version, which is in part read by Philip Pullman, who obviously also wrote the book, but it has a full cast. So it's not like a dynamic audiobook with all the sound effects and stuff, but the full cast kind of gives it a little something extra. It's almost like a radio play. And I just think that it's so much fun. So highly recommend that. It's good
Awesome.
for like a road trip too, if you have like younger passengers in the car with you.
One of my first audiobooks that I read was The Seven Husbands of, or listened to, I should
you
say,
swallow that?
Micah.
The Seven Husbands.
Oh my gosh.
Hey, this is a different show now.
I'm so glad
You're
I
right.
have an audio clip of Micah saying, "Did you swallow that?"
Welcome to WTF edition. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, written by Taylor Jenkins Reid, narrated by three people, actually. Alma Cuervo, Julia Whelan, and Robin Miles. So we get a few different narrators, and they bring a lot of different voices to the reading, which I thought was a really great experience. Excellent voice acting. It depicts old Hollywood and the secrets within. It's a great summer read, I would say. And I think, I bet a lot of our listeners are familiar with this book. It went viral, if you will. It's just very popular. I went into a tiki bar last week, and the hostess had the book on her counter to pass the time. I was like, great book, great book. She's like, I know, right? So The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Check that one out. So, to wrap up today's episode, we are going to try to narrate an audiobook ourselves. And listeners, we want you to let us know who does the best job, who should get the gig as the narrator behind a book that we, write ourselves one day. So, we are going to take turns reading from the classic The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. Now, here's the twist. This will be unedited. If you screw up your read, that's how it's appearing in the audiobook. Ernest is counting on you. Mr. Hemingway is counting on you.
From beyond the grave.
Yeah, I was going to
From
say, I don't
beyond-
think he's that worried about it.
The ghost of Ernest is counting on you. Okay? Just go along with it. I'm trying to raise the stakes. The Hemingway estate is counting on you for this modern day reread. Okay,
If I
so here
mess
we go.
this up, I can never spend time in Oak Park, Illinois anymore.
Is that where
that's
he
Ernest's
spent time?
place. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's why I picked this. Okay, so here we go. The Old Man and the Sea. This is a passage from the middle of the book. Usually when he smelled the land breeze, he woke up and dressed to go and wake the boy. But tonight, the smell of the land breeze came very early, and he knew it was too early in his dream, and went on dreaming to see the white peaks of the islands rising from the sea. And then he dreamed of the different harbors and roadsteads of the Canary Islands.
He no longer dreamed of storms, nor of women, nor of great occurrences, nor of great fish, nor fights, nor contests of strength, nor of his wife. He swallowed them all. He only dreamed of places now and of the lions on the beach. They played like young cats in the dusk, and he loved them as he loved the boy. He never dreamed about the boy. He simply woke, looked out the open door at the moon, and unrolled his trousers and put them on. He urinated outside the shack, and then went up the road to wake the boy. He was shivering with the morning cold, but he knew he would shiver himself warm, and that soon he would be rowing.
The door of the house where the boy lived was unlocked, and he opened it and walked in quietly with his bare feet. The boy was asleep on a cot in the first room, and the old man could see him clearly with the light that came in from the dying moon. He took hold of one foot gently and held it until the boy woke and turned and looked at him. The old man nodded, and the boy took his trousers from the chair by the bed and, sitting on the bed, pulled them on. The old man went out the door, and the boy came after him. He was sleepy, and the old man put his arm across his shoulders and said, "I'm sorry."
Kiva, the boy said, "it is what a man must do." They walked down the road to the old man's shack, and all along the road, in the dark, barefoot men were moving, carrying the masts of their boats. When they reached the old man's shack, the boy took the rolls of line in the basket and the harpoon and gaff, and the old man carried the mast with the furled sail on his shoulder. "Do you want coffee?" the boy asked. "We'll put the gear in the boat and then get some."
They had coffee from condensed milk cans at an early morning place that served fishermen. "How did you sleep, old man?" the boy asked. He was waking up now, although it was still hard for him to leave his sleep. "Very well, Manolin," the old man said. "I feel confident today." "So do I," said the boy. "Now, I must get your sardines and mine and your fresh baits." He brings our gear himself. He never wants anyone to carry anything.
I don't think anybody screwed up. So good job,
Micah
everybody.
added a line, which would
did he?
totally have him fired from audio narration for the entire...
Hemingway's rolling in his grave. So listeners, do you think any one of us stood out in particular? Please let us know via social media.
It's hard to do because some people had dialogue and other people didn't have dialogue.
I know. But we wanted to not be repetitive, so I just tried to find a passage that had the best of both worlds.
Laura got the Spanish.
Yes.
Probably better she did, because I didn't know what that was. I think it's Portuguese, right?
Yeah. So I don't know what that is, because I was like, is that? I'm gonna assume it's Spanish.
See, as the narrator, Laura, it's open to your interpretation.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's not like I read it as que va. That's not, at least in Spanish, that's not how you spell que. So I don't know if that was a typo or if that's actually how it was written, but I made my own interpretation.
Well, we'll have to reach out to the Hemingway estate for comments.
I'm sure there's an audiobook somewhere.
I was more thinking about, the estate of whoever copy pasted this into this document.
From a PDF I found on Google? No, stop. One area we did not address today were immersive audiobooks, and there are also immersive audiobooks that come with many voice actors and sound effects and a score. Fourth Wing and the ACOTAR series both have immersive editions produced by Graphic Audio, and we recently learned that the Harry Potter books were going to be turned into immersive editions, which is pretty exciting as well. I will say I listened to the Fourth Wing one. There's a lot. I listened to the sample. There's a lot going on in it. It was borderline distracting. I think the Harry Potter one will handle it better, but maybe we'll explore immersive audiobooks more in a future installment of What the Hype. So that concludes this week's episode. Thanks everybody for listening. We are a new show, so we do really need your support. Follow us in your podcast app and leave a review. This is going to help make the show a success. This is just super important, especially in the early days of the show. Follow us on social media too. On TikTok, YouTube, Twitch, and Instagram, we are What the Hype Podcast, and our website is whatthehypepodcast.com. Then, if you still use X, we are What the Hype Show over there. And if you want to email us about anything, you can email whatthehypepodcast@gmail.com. And last but not least, if you have a friend or family member who needs convincing about why audiobooks are so great, definitely share this episode with a friend and tell them we're walking through every aspect of pop culture each week. So that is The Hype. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.